Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today we have a guest that is a writer, animator, uh, done various other things, a film distributor, I believe, restorer, many other roles. You can clarify that when we talk to him. This is Ray Pointer. How are you today, sir?
Well, surviving a Labor Day weekend, and
Yeah,
I didn't labor.
no. This will be up later than Labor Day, but hey, I don't care if people know when we record it. Yeah, it'll probably be up in about a month, so I'm a little bit ahead, but that's okay. Usually what I do, I mean, I obviously know you're like the Fleischer guy. I put the Max Fleischer image behind me from your book, which I'll relay it now, is The Art and Inventions of Max Fleischer. If you don't have this book, go get it now. And just wanted to know, I mean, you've worked in the industry, you've done a lot of different things. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got your start and your interest in Fleischer and in animation.
Well, I can blame my mother for that because I was of the first generation where all these old theatricals were being shown on television. And my mother got me started watching the Out of the Inkwell films that would start at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it made such an impression on me that I think that cultivated an interest in drawing because of the magical things that came off from the pen. And Max Fleischer would be on there and he would draw the things and they would either come off from the pen or come out of the ink bottle or variations of the same theme. And then eventually he would interact with the drawings that would come off from the page and come into reality. And I was fascinated by those things. And I was so fascinated by it that I had a dream. And I dreamt that I got out of bed as usual and Out of the Inkwell was on television. So I wanted to get in closer and get in on the action. And so I stepped through the television screen like Alice through the looking glass. And I was suddenly in a black and white world. And I was in Max Fleischer's office. It was rather nondescript, a bare floor and everything, but there was a wooden teacher's desk and he was seated in a captain's chair. He was wearing a herringbone tweed suit with a vest. And he stopped what he was doing and he pivoted over and picked me up and he said, "Well, Ray, I'm glad you came to visit me. Now come on over here." And he picked me up and sat me on his lap. And he showed me his drawing equipment, his celluloid triangle, his T-square,
Hmm.
his drawing board, and his crow quill pen. And then there was a great big ink bottle. It was maybe 5, 10 times the size of a normal one.
Right.
And he brought that out and he said, "Now, Ray, I'm going to bring out the ink bottle and the clown's going to come out." He took the stopper off and Coco stuck his head out, rubbed his eyes and looked around. He saw me and ducked down with a little splash. I wanted to see the clown. So I went to reach forward, and as I brought the ink bottle forward, it kind of caught on the desk and it tipped, and there was a splash of ink. And Max jumped up in a reflex and dropped me, and I'd fallen out of bed. One foot tangled up in the quilt, sort of like little Nemo in Slumberland at the end of those.
Right.
And I'll tell you something, I continued to watch those cartoons, but it was sort of like this, yeah, this is nice. I'm glad when it's over with, And I had a phobia about black ink for many years.
Wow.
Any other color ink like blue or anything like that was fine. It wasn't until I was in high school I finally realized why I hated lettering, because I was using that India ink that smelled like rotten eggs.
Mm.
And once I recalled that dream, then I got over that. But here's what's strange about that. I was a preschooler. I think I hadn't quite turned 5 yet. But when I was 11, I started experimenting with animation. And then after about 2 or 3 years, my dad appeared in a Jam Handy film called the Mail Flow.
Hmm.
And the main post office downtown at Michigan Central, where he was for 10 years, they tested the first automatic sorting systems for mail systems, and he was in that film.
Hmm.
So he had the knowledge of Jam Handy and of course the Jam Handy films, because they made a lot of them for service training and so forth. And so they were the big industrial film producer in the Detroit area. Of course, we had 4 major studios there, but they were the biggest. because of their connections to General Motors. So he said to me, you ought to have the people at Jam Handy see what you've done. And I figured, well, probably eventually, but I didn't think I was ready to show what I had yet.
Mhm.
So I had graduated junior high. This was in 1967.
Mhm.
And so I wrote a letter to them. And a few days later, I got a reply. And so they asked me to come down for an interview the following Tuesday. So I came down that afternoon, and I was finishing an animated version of The Wizard of Oz that I started when I was 12. I did it with cutouts and manipulated with layers of glass to have three-dimensional effects and natural shadows. And that sort of thing was inspired by the 3D backgrounds that you saw in the Popeye cartoons, because I always wanted to figure out how they did that. So I was trying in some way to do that effect as well.
Mhm.
And so I was showing the film in the camera room to the manager, Bob Kennedy, and I had my sound on tape, and people started drifting in because they were hearing the sound. They're wondering what's going on. And the next thing you know, I had a full house standing in the back room. And I figured, well, this is nice, you know. And they're laughing and applauding in all the right places. And that's quite reassuring. That's letting you know I must have done something right, you know.
Mhm.
And so later on, when the lights came on, there were these two short, square-shaped men that were standing in front. Now, I hadn't quite had my adult growth yet, but they were shorter than me. They came up like to my shoulders.
Hmm.
And so I was introduced to these two gentlemen. One of them was Frank Goldman, who invented the three-hole punch system for animation registration,
Mhm.
and his very best friend, Max Fleischer.
Wow.
And so the dream had come full circle 10 years later. And Max was so fascinated by what I had already shown at that point. And I certainly knew who he was. It had been years. He was quite elderly, and it was obvious that he'd been ill for many years.
Mhm.
So frankly, if they hadn't introduced me to him, I might not have recognized him, but I realized the connection.
Mhm.
He spent 20 minutes talking to me,
Mhm.
asking me how I thought of these ideas. I said, but Mr. Fleischer, I was inspired by your Popeye cartoons. And I always tried to figure out how you did that. And so I was going to try to find my way of doing the same thing, because I thought it would be great to have a longer format film using that technique.
Right.
And he was just so encouraging. And he asked me, how long have you been doing this? And I said, well, for about maybe 3 or 4 years. He said, my dear young man, you have accomplished far more in those 3 or 4 years than it would take us 10 years to train people in.
Hmm. That's cool.
That was quite a tremendous thing. And of course, I realized I had an awful lot to learn,
Mhm.
but that is 20 minutes I will always remember for the rest of my life. And that was 55 years ago.
Don't I
So
know it?
during that
That's when
summer,
I was born.
yeah, so during that summer that I was there, I
Mhm.
started picking up on these anecdotes because there were people still around there that remembered when Max was there, and it had only been maybe 11 or 12 years since he had been there, you know.
Mhm.
And so their memories were still fresh. And so I figured somebody needs to document this information because it's never been in books. And so that was sort of the beginning. So I started to document these anecdotes that I was given. I got a lot of information from Frank Goldman, and he also sent me some letters that were just chock full of a lot of information that had to be documented. And so then when I started college in 1970, I started in full force to do the formal research.
Hmm.
And I went to the main library, which was right off campus. And the fortunate thing was that they had a patent room. So I went through and I looked up all of Max's patents and read through them and made copies of them. And I looked up every periodical that you could possibly find that was available at that time.
Right.
And after 2 years, I had exhausted all available material. I figured, isn't there more?
Hmm.
But again, at that time, you were in the old Dewey Decimal System, you know, the card catalog and everything like that. And that's about all that you had available. And so my vision at that time was to do a documentary. Well, it turned out that my concept was probably beyond the scope of what Wayne State was capable of doing at that time. But I had the idea of going on to the pre-PBS version of educational television that used to be called National Educational Television, NET.
Yep.
And we had a tie-in with WTVS then, at that time. So after 2 years, it seemed like the scope of my project was beyond their realization. So I figured, well, I've got all this information, maybe I should write a book.
Mhm.
Well, in September of 1972, Max passed away. Max's son, Richard, I'd written to him, and he put me in touch with his sister, Ruth, because she had a great deal of information because she worked in the studio. And she was married to Seymour Nightel, who everybody knows from
Yeah.
Popeye cartoons and Famous Studios cartoons. And so she told me that there was already a book in progress, and she put me in touch with Leslie Cabarga.
Okay.
And so the timing was such that it was like the pieces came together because Ruth asked me, why do you want to do this? And I said, well, I guess because I've always liked jigsaw puzzles.
Mhm.
And she laughed and she said, well, you've got that about right, because I guess my dad's life is something of a jigsaw puzzle. And she admitted that in my research, I knew more than what she could remember. And she said, realize the early part of my dad's career, I can't tell you because that was before I was born. And I
Mm.
said, I realized that because she wasn't born until 1906.
Mhm.
And of course, he had several careers before that. But the main focus of that is the fact that his central interest in mechanics and technology was formed at an early age when he and his older brother, Charlie, they were born in Austria.
Mhm.
At the time, Krakow was in Austro-Hungary, it wasn't Poland then.
Mm. Yep.
I've gone to great lengths to try to get people to understand that entry on Wikipedia was altered. And my publisher asked me to sort out the entry on Max Fleischer that was on Wikipedia because it was such a jumbled up mess. And so I rewrote it for them, and it was fine for 2 years until some robot changed it. So
Interesting.
yeah, so the book does set the political history in accuracy. Not only that, but I gained a copy of the 1905 census.
Mhm.
It's documented William, Amalia, Charles, and Max as the country of origin in Austria.
Mhm.
So anyway, when Charlie and Max were kids, they were 4 and 6, something like that. And you can imagine their first impression when they arrived in New York Harbor, seeing the Statue of Liberty. And they were amazed at the technology that was
Mhm.
involved in building that statue. That
Right.
was the spark of their interest.
Hmm.
And Max considered mechanics as the art of the 20th century. So that was his motivation. And at an early age, Max's granddaughter, Ginny, through her mother, they saved just about everything.
Mhm.
As Max's sketchbook from when he was 12 years old. And that shows at that early age, that interest in technical things like various machines and things that were hooked up to batteries and guns, how
Mhm.
a gun would operate.
More than animation itself. Animation was just kind of an avenue that he could
Yeah, it was
use those inventions.
yes, and it was a secondary thing.
Yeah.
And the thing that's amazing is the fact that he came into animation by accident,
Yeah.
not by design.
Mhm.
Because as I said, he had several careers until he got into animation, but his initial interest was to become a cartoonist. And at an early age, he eventually became a cartoonist at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
Mhm.
And it was there that he met John R. Bray, who is a former Michiganian. And Bray recommended Max as a technical illustrator because Max took night classes at the Art Students League and Cooper Union.
Mhm.
And so this led to him being assigned to a job that took him to Boston. So he got married on Christmas Eve in 1905, and then they went to Boston for about 5 years. And then he had an offer to become the art editor for Popular Science magazine. So he was back in New York around 1912, 1913, something like that. Well, it was in 1913 that Bray made his first cartoon after he had visited Winsor McCay. And a year later, the Bray Studio was turning out some of the first commercially produced cartoons.
Mm.
The Bray Studio and the Beret Studio were the first two commercial animation studios. Beret was a little bit ahead of Bray,
Mhm.
but Bray pretty much had the market sewed up. The thing of it is, there were a lot of compromises in producing those, and they were kind of jerky. In fact, it's amazing because they weren't as good as Bray's initial cartoon, which you can find on YouTube. The Artist's Dream, also, it's also called The Dachshund and the Sausage. So it's rather clever, it's fairly well done.
Mhm.
Well, the story has it that Max's boss, Wildemir Kemper, rolls right off the tongue. And his wife went to the movies one night.
Mhm.
And apparently they had gone to the movies several times and seen some of these early animated cartoons. So the cartoons were usually used as sort of like in the old theatrical structure where you would have the warm-up act, and they would be used as a warm-up act for the main feature. Well, one of those cartoons came on, and Kemper's wife said, "Oh God, I hate these things." And so Max's boss came in the next morning, and he told Max about this experience. And he said, "Max, you're a clever guy. You know photography and mechanics. Can you figure out a way to make animated cartoons look better?"
Mm.
And so, realizing the painstaking and time-consuming process that McKay went through, he figured there had to be another way through mechanics and photography to solve the problem. Because in those days, nobody really knew the principles of animation. They were still figuring it out.
Right.
McKay figured it out, but it took a long time to do it. And he did it all from imagination. Of course, he was a tremendous draftsman. There was no doubt about that.
Mhm.
And the story has it, he solved a lot of his animation problems through a knowledge of geometry.
Mhm.
So somehow Max figured if you photographed live action, you could study that and get the timing of the action to get realistic movement. So the original concept appears to have been just for a test, according to the patent drawing, a Boy Scout doing semaphore.
Mm.
Now, how the device came about is a story in itself, because those who have seen the patent drawing, which is in the book,
Yeah.
it appears to be a cannibalized projector that was set on an incline board, and then there's an easel on a raised platform or raised legs, and then there's an opening in the drawing board with a glass pane, and then that allows the project. That's right. Yeah, that allows the
Oops.
to come through, and then you put the paper
Anyway.
over that, and you can trace off from that image as your guide.
Mhm.
Well, the story behind that is that Charlie and Joe ran an open air movie theater one summer when they were living on Pitkin Avenue in Brooklyn, in
Mhm.
Brownsville. But they didn't do too well because the timing was such that either through the humidity or rain or mosquitoes, they didn't do so well. And
Mhm.
the company went bankrupt. And so by the time everything was settled, the proceeds that left them with a few folding chairs and that projector.
Mhm.
So they used the projector and cannibalized it. And Charlie rigged up a means of the light source based on an automobile headlight that was powered by an automobile battery. Because those old projectors used carbon arc light, which put out heat, it was pretty
Right.
hot. And so as long as the film was running, it wasn't in the danger of catching fire. However, if
Mhm.
you're holding that film still to trace off from it, you can't have a hot light source
No.
because that was that film that was dangerous.
Mhm.
And so fortunately, the headlight was cool enough and the distance was such that it was just bright enough so that you could see it well enough to trace from.
Hmm.
So again, he's doing this in his spare time. And since we can conclude that it was the Boy Scout, all you have to do is have a working model to prove that the idea works in order to secure the patent.
Mm.
But when you look at it, there's a span of about 3 or 4 years between when the patent was actually applied for, and then it was granted a year or two later. During that time, there were several experiments that occurred. So naturally, the first one we can conclude was the Boy Scout, just to prove that it worked.
Mhm.
There was a second experiment, according to Max's brother Joe, because Joe and Charlie helped him build it. So Charlie was there. Charlie and Joe, primarily Joe, worked with Max on the second experiment.
Mhm.
So here's where we have the Achilles heel, so to speak. Max was very technically visionary, but his weakness was in coming up with original characters. Now, this is what's unfortunate, because when he was a cartoonist back in the Brooklyn Eagle days, he had two original cartoon strips that he could have gone back on
Mhm.
to have used. But he never thought about his past accomplishments. He was always trying to go forward.
Mm.
The two comic strips that he had, probably the best one he could have used was Little Algie. It was
Mm.
about this little boy's adventures living in Brooklyn and the aspirations to get out of the slums and that sort of thing. Because
Mhm.
Max certainly had a lot of motivation to get out of poverty and live a middle-class life. And a lot of his editorial cartoons reflected an admiration of middle-class life. So that's what's interesting in the fact that he didn't fall back on what he already had before. He had that, and then he also had a strip about E.G. Posher, the photography fiend, and about this awkward photographer who was trying to get all these interesting camera angles, and he would end up having some sort of a disaster because he wasn't looking at what he was doing, and he would run into a bridge where he's trying to capture a picture of a train and didn't look at the schedule, and there's another one coming from the other direction, and it goes by, and he goes flying into the air, and the caption says he heard the bell, meaning clang, he got hit.
Right.
So unfortunately, he didn't look back at his past accomplishments for something original.
Mhm.
So according to Joe, and Joe was very meticulous he kept a journal about
That's
what was
good.
going on.
Mhm.
And so Max got a hold of a print of a Chaplin film, and he traced that off. So that took about 8 months or so,
Mm.
tracing off and inking it. And then the process of photographing it. And this is another thing that I go into my book, which is essential. At this point in time, we're talking about something that happened 100 years ago. The equipment did not exist to make animation. It all had to be adapted because they didn't even have motorized cameras.
Yeah.
So he had to figure out a way how to do this to maintain a consistency in the exposures. Because one thing he did find out in his very first experiment was that there had to be a regulation on the exposures. That he
Right.
did find out from the first one.
Mhm.
The camera he was using did not have a proper shutter.
Mm.
It was one of those disc shutters that had a single opening. So when you turned it by hand to turn the crank, you couldn't be sure that the opening was in the exact same position.
Mm.
So if it's open fully on the one exposure, and it comes around and is 3/4 open or half open, then you're going to have an inconsistent exposure, and that's causes.
Right.
So based on that, he had to physically cap and uncap between exposures using a darkroom timer
Hmm.
to know how long to expose the film until they figured out a mechanical means of controlling the camera.
Wow.
So anyway, he spent about 8 months doing this Chaplin film. Now, by this time, Dave was working as a film cutter at Pathé. And Dave was able to get him an interview with this Frenchman by the name of Burst, Jacques Burst. He was the representative to Charles Pathé, who was in Paris.
Mhm.
And of course, Burst was impressed because of the fluid execution.
Mhm.
But of course, the image of Chaplin, they dare not touch because Chaplin was even back then notorious about suing about any infringement on his image.
Mhm.
And so he said, well, we're impressed, but if you can come back with something original, we'd be interested. And he said, by the way, how long did it take you to produce this? And he said, well, I did this in my spare time. It took about 8 months. And he said, well, 8 months, no, we couldn't allow something like that. If
Mm.
you come out with something like every 2 weeks, every month, maybe, yeah. 8 months, nix, you know. He said, well, we'll come back with something a little more original and something that won't take quite so long to do. So that was experiment number 2. Here comes experiment number 3. And so Dave was suggesting, well, how about my doing the clown? Because he had been a clown at Coney Island, and he
Right.
still had the costume. So they rigged up something where they had a bedsheet background and they shot it on the roof of the apartment building. And so Dave went through these clown antics and they shot that. And again, they spent another 8 months tracing that off, and all 3 brothers were working on that.
Mhm.
And so he came back and Pathé said, yes, we like that. So Pathé set him up in an office in Orange, New Jersey, where the headquarters were. They even built them additional rotoscopes.
Mm.
And so Max was impressed with Teddy Roosevelt.
Mhm.
And he wanted to do a cartoon about one of Teddy Roosevelt's famous hunting trips. So they came up with this story about the Chanticleer, which is this big rooster,
Mhm.
instead of doing the clown. And Dave said, well, they like the clown, let's do the clown. He said, well, I think a political thing would be better.
Mm.
They went through the whole thing of Joe acting as Teddy Roosevelt, and Dave put on this chicken outfit, and they filmed that. And they spent another 5-6 months working on that, and the results was disastrous. And they were fired over that. It was not successful. So Max was back around shopping the idea around. So he still had the clown reel. So he was at an outer office to Paramount about to see Adolf Zucker.
Mhm.
In comes John Bray. And he hadn't seen Bray in about maybe 5 or 10 years. And it turned out that Bray already had a contract with Paramount.
Mm.
And he said, well, come on over to my studio because I have an exclusivity with Paramount. And Bray hired Max as production manager because he valued him as an artist
Mhm.
because of his technical abilities and so on. And from what Frank Goldman told me, that Max had an intuition about how to apply their best efforts in executing the best art in areas where you could use shortcuts and things like that, so that they could work more economically and more efficiently.
Mhm.
And so, in addition to just being the production manager of everything that they were doing, they had the entertainment films as well as educational films.
Mhm.
And so, just before they were getting going with Out of the Inkwell, World War I started. And Bray had a contract to do training films for the Army. So Bray sent Max to Fort Sill with Frank's cousin, Jack Leventhal. And so they did training films on how to read a contour map, how to fire the Stokes mortar,
Mhm.
things of that nature. And so after the armistice, then Out of the Inkwell started up in full force.
Right.
And apparently, Bray found a way to use actually, there were 4 experiments because the Chanticleer also counts as the fourth experiment.
Mhm.
So Bray apparently found some way of using that footage. And they used to appear on the old Bray catalog as experiments 1, 2, and 3, even though there were 4. So we
Mm.
can conclude that the Chaplin experiment was skipped over.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Sounds.
we're still trying to find if at all possible, if any of those experiments still exist.
Hmm.
Because the earliest Out of the Inkwell film started its release in 1919, and that would have been The Clown's Pup.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, right now, it only exists in inferior 16 millimeter dupes from Dover Films, which was one of those home movie sources. But
Right.
it's what it is. But that was the very first one. There was the official release where you had the combination of the live action and animation. And that format was actually already established at Bray. But it was done so successfully and cleverly, the way Max handled it, that it's synonymous with him and Out of the Inkwell.
Mhm.
And so they did it for essentially 2 years, 1919 to 1921. There were 12 of them, maybe a few more than that, but only half of them survived. We're still hoping that there are about 6 of them. I think one of them has finally come to surface, the kangaroo,
Mhm.
toxic kangaroo. We have found that one. But one that would really be a great find would be Cartoon Land,
Mm.
because it had all the current Hearst cartoons. And because of Max's connection with the cartooning circles, Hearst allowed it.
Yeah.
That was a great find.
Yeah.
There was one called Restaurant, another one called Poker that's missing.
Mm.
But as it is, half of them survive. And to find one in 35 millimeter is a tremendous rarity. But we
Mm.
found one from 1921.
Mm.
But finding any of the braid material in 35 millimeter is a tremendous, tremendous find, because we're talking about 100 years ago.
Right.
And back in the 70s, when I started searching for some of these things and started my own collection, I contacted the Bray studio to find out how many of these I could buy. And the negatives at that time, some of them were not printable. They told me.
Mm.
And they asked me if I would, in fact, the Clown's Pup was one of them that I ordered. And this was 1972, 73, and they couldn't print it. The negative was in such terrible condition. And
Mm.
so they asked me if I would accept substitutes. Well, yes, I was happy to get anything.
Mhm.
And so then it turns out that I got a print of what was supposed to have been a rarity at the time, the Chinaman, but then that's turned up as well. But these turned out to have been the TV prints.
Mm.
And so what happened was they recycled them for TV exhibition in 1950. And what they did on most of them, with the exception of the first one, the Tantalizing Fly, at least that one had one of the title cards. So at least I had the motif.
Mhm.
The rest of them, they cut off the intertitles,
Mhm.
narration. And so apparently the narration coincided with what the title cards were.
Mm.
And so then 20 years ago, I put together 4 volumes in VHS. And then when DVDs came out, I consolidated them into a 2-disc set.
Mm.
Volumes 1 and 2 on the one disc, and volumes 3 and 4 on the second disc. And I tried to recreate title cards. So fortunately, I had that one as a motif to work from that had the little Bray signature on it.
Mhm.
And you could always tell where they cut them up because there was an unexplained hitch or jump in the continuity that indicated that's where there was a title inserted. In
Mm.
some cases, and I found from some other sources, some of them were purposely cut out because they had ethnic slurs in them.
Mm. Makes sense.
So
But
you can understand why for TV they would take those out.
yeah.
So that's what I did at that particular time.
Mhm.
And the thing that's interesting about that, when I started my company as a sideline when I was still active in the studios, I was inspired by when this was very popular, called the
Yep.
whole catalog. Now, this is an edition from spring 2001. And we were in there on this page.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I started the company initially working with Ken Southworth, whose name you've seen on the Walter Lantz cartoons and the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, a lot of the Snagglepuss cartoons he
Mhm.
had. And he wanted to do a home instruction video to pass on some of his knowledge. And this company had been stringing him along, and he has been long retired living in Anaheim. And I saw how earnest he was and how much he wanted to do this, you know. I said, well, I can do that for you. It's not going to cost us very much money. And so I did the first volume with him, and the whole Toon catalog picked it up. And they liked it so well, and it sold so quickly. We made our initial investment back, and so we did 2 more volumes. So based on that, I figured, well, this is eventually going to play itself out. And I had this film collection. And what motivated me was when the whole toon catalog came out, that was back in the VHS days.
Mhm.
There were a lot of rare cartoons that were on a lot of these VHS tapes. And because of their rarity, a lot of them were from poor sources. And there were disclaimers that said quality, mediocre, or poor, or very poor. And when I saw some of the titles, I wondered, well, wait a minute, I've got prints of some of these cartoons and the prints are pretty good. So there's no reason for it to be poor. So why not I put out something that's a little bit better and see what happens? So what I did was I came out with a sort of a cavalcade from my collection called Before Walt.
Mhm.
Sight unseen, when I described it, they already bought 50. So I said, well, I gotta get this out. I later revised it in DVD version in 2006.
Yep.
With the centennial of American animation.
Mhm.
And so it covers everybody chronologically. And then on the extras, there are individual profiles of all the pioneers. So that was the beginning of that. And of course, I had the Out of the Inkwell collection. And that has been my biggest seller for the past 20 years.